Thank you for joining us this evening for tonight's program on Africa and democracy in Africa with Dr. Monde Muyangwa, Judy Moore, and John Temen. I'm Claire Noble, the Director of Programming for the Vail Symposium, on behalf of Chris Sable, our Executive Director, Dale Mosier, our Board Chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium Board. Welcome. We are now celebrating 50 years of convening locally and thinking globally. Few items to be aware of before we get started. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see an option for Q&A. Please type your questions in there at any time. We'll get to those questions later in the program, and we'll get to as many as time permits. Tonight's program will run until 7 p.m. It's being recorded, and you'll be able to find that recording at vailsymposium.org. I'd like to take just a moment to thank the organizations and individuals who've helped make tonight's program possible. Our sponsors include the Town of Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Antlers at Vail, and the Vail Daily. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. Cindy Ingalls and Leela and Walt Mischer have underwritten the summer season. The geopolitical series is underwritten by Jeannie and Dale Mosier. And a special congratulation goes out to the Mosier clan, which increased by 1 this past week. Jeannie and Dale are now grandparents. The Vail Symposium is supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. Thank you to all of our donors. We couldn't do it without you. Our next program next week will be on Wednesday, August 25th. It will be an in-person program at the Vail Interfaith Chapel. We welcome 2 legendary journalists, Judy Woodruff and Al Hunt. Tonight, we'll focus on the state of democracy in Africa. Let's meet our distinguished panel. Dr. Monde Muyangwa is the director of the Africa program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where she leads programs that analyze and offer practical, actionable policy options addressing some of Africa's most critical issues. She holds a PhD in international relations and a BA in politics, philosophy, and economics from the University of Oxford, as well as a BA in public administration and economics from the University of Zambia. She was a Rhodes Scholar, a Wingate Scholar, and the University of Zambia valedictory speaker for her graduation class. Judy Moore is a Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development. He previously served as Liberia's Minister of Public Works with oversight over the construction and maintenance of public infrastructure. He served as Deputy Chief of Staff to President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. As one of the president's trusted advisors, he also played a crucial role in supporting the president as Liberia responded to the West Africa Ebola outbreak and shaped its post-Ebola outlook. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Berea College and a master's degree in foreign policy and international security from Georgetown University. John Temen is the director of the Africa program at Freedom House, overseeing the organization's efforts to advance democracy and human rights across the continent. He was a member of the U.S. Department of State's policy planning staff and director of the U.S. Institute of Peace's Africa program. Previously, he was a Fulbright Fellow in Ghana, a visiting fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's currently a non-resident senior associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to our panel. We'll begin with opening remarks from John Temen.
Great. Thank you so much, Claire, and really thanks to all the organizers for having us today. It's great to share this esteemed panel with some really excellent co-panelists. I'm going to start, and there's our first slide, with a brief presentation that I hope will help set the scene for the conversation that follows. So, as Claire mentioned, I work at Freedom House. We're a global organization focused on democracy and human rights issues. One of the things that we do is produce a report every year called Freedom in the World, where we look at democracy and human rights and ultimately freedom across every country in the world, including the United States. And we do an assessment, and if you go to the next slide, we rate countries on a series of indicators. So here's a little bit more just about how we do it. It's a project we've done since 1973. And we have this 100-point scale that's divided between political rights and civil liberties, and that's how we rate each country that we're looking at. And then there's a bit of math in the background that leads to us categorizing countries in these three buckets of free, partly free, and not free. So what I'm going to talk through tonight is just how Africa looks within the broader freedom in the world that we produce every year. One thing to note is that everything I'm talking about tonight pertains to what happened in Africa in the year 2020. We do this report every year. It covers the calendar year. It comes out in about February or March. So this most recent report that I'll be talking about tonight covered calendar year 2020. Just before I jump into it, one thing I really do want to emphasize is Africa is an incredibly diverse place. If we're talking just about sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking about 49 different countries. So I'm going to talk about some of the big picture themes and trends, but it's really important to emphasize that point that things are very different across these very diverse countries. There's some difficult news, which I'm going to get into, but there's also a lot of really good news that's going on as well that doesn't make the headlines as much. So if we can go to the next slide. Here are some of the top line findings that we had concerning sub-Saharan Africa in the year 2020 in freedom in the world. Unfortunately, it was a difficult year for democracy in Africa, and it was a difficult year for democracy in the world. At Freedom House, we talk about 15 years of global democratic decline. That means for 15 straight years, more countries have gone down in our ratings than have gone up. And Africa was part of that trend last year, and there were 21 countries that went down in our ratings, only 7 improved last year, and that gap between the 21 and the 7 is actually the largest gap we've had in Africa over that 15 years of global decline. So that's a difficult picture. A lot of the decline that we saw are in countries that we put in that category of partly free, sort of the middle category. And this is consistent with what we see globally. We're seeing a lot of countries that have done reasonably well in terms of democracy and freedoms that are now regressing in the last few years. And that's a real concern. Part of that trend in Africa is in West Africa. That sub-region in particular has really performed well, relatively speaking, in terms of democracy over a number of years. But just these past few years, we're seeing a real decline in West Africa, and 8 of the declines that we saw last year alone were in the West Africa region. Part of what explains those declines, both in West Africa and across the region, have been a resurgence of some coups that have been happening in several countries, and also some changes in term limits. And this is an unfortunate trend on the continent where leaders have been changing the rules about term limits to benefit themselves. And that's something that in our scores really works against them. We're also seeing a lot of the impact of COVID in terms of democracy and freedoms. Leaders who are using the pretext of COVID response to really crack down and limit political space, especially in the context of elections. We go to the next slide. So this is the big picture of Africa as we put countries into these 3 categories of free, partly free, and not free. So you see the free countries are the ones in green. The yellow ones are partly free, the purple ones not free. And you see some really interesting grouping of countries where you see a bunch of free countries in Southern Africa, and you see that cluster of partly free countries in East Southern Africa and in West Africa, and then a big grouping of not free countries through Central Africa and up through the Horn. There's a lot of nuance here. You know, there's a lot that goes into these 3 particular categories, but this is sort of the big picture. And you see here, there were 3 countries that changed between categories this last year. Both Mali and Zimbabwe, unfortunately, went from partly free to not free. The good news was that Seychelles went from partly free to free. Go to the next slide, please. And this just goes a little bit deeper into the countries that moved a lot within our ratings. And as a reminder, we have this 100-point scale. And so these are the countries that made significant movements either up or down in this last year of our ratings. Some really notable improvements. Sudan is a really encouraging story, a tenuous success story, but we can get more into that perhaps in Q&A, the revolution that happened several years ago to kick out President al-Bashir. Really interesting story this past year in Malawi, where the Supreme Court overturned a pretty flawed election, and they had another one that was much better that led to a change in power. Then on the negative side, there was a coup in Mali that led to a really big decline in our ratings. And also I mentioned term limits. That was a big concern in Cote d'Ivoire, where the president engineered a third term. Tanzania is a country that has been declining in our ratings for some time and had another difficult year last year. Although interestingly, this year they have a new president in place, in part because the previous president passed away, possibly because of COVID. And we are seeing some encouraging signs of a turnaround in Tanzania. If we go to the next slide, this widens the time frame a little bit. So these are the movements in certain countries across 3 years in freedom in the world. Again, 100-point rating. So we see some notable gains. Ethiopia is there, but there's a big caveat with Ethiopia. They made some really important gains in the early time of Prime Minister Abiy, some important opening of political space, but that has very much reversed in the last year or so, which will be reflected in our new ratings. Ethiopia is in the midst of a horrible civil war right now. We can get more into that. Again, mentioned the progress in Sudan and also some important progress in other countries such as Angola, such as Mauritania. But then we see some of those declines too. I mentioned Tanzania, that's a big decline for them over 3 years. And then as mentioned, we see a bunch of West African countries that have also been declining, countries like Benin and Mali that used to do well in terms of democracy, also Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso, all part of that West Africa decline in particular. Next slide. This just emphasizes the point that a lot of the declines that we're seeing both in Africa and globally are happening in those middle class, those partly free countries as we categorize them. And you see that depicted here. Actually, in free countries around the world and in Africa, once they get there, they tend to stay there for the most part. But as you see here, some really notable declines in the partly free countries, as well as some declines in those not free countries. Next slide. I wanted to make a point here just about elections in Africa, and it's been a pretty difficult run right now for Africa. And these things ebb and flow, and they depend a lot on how the electoral calendar shakes out. And there's actually a big exception because Zambia just had a really impressive election, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that tonight. But the point I'd make here is that I have concerns about the state of elections in Africa and citizens' faith in elections as a means for change. There were several elections late last year that were pretty tough in Tanzania in particular. And then this year, there have been this difficult string of elections. Elections in Uganda earlier this year were pretty violent and pretty difficult. And a number of these other countries have also had less than free and fair elections. And you see one of the points in this slide is that a bunch of these elections are happening in countries that we categorize as not free and partly free. And so really the concern that I have there is, are Africans continuing to see elections as a means of change and as a means of removing leaders who are not living up to expectations? And so if we go to the final slide, this actually puts some data behind that, because this is finding from the Afrobarometer, which is really the gold standard in terms of public opinion survey work in Africa. One of the things they do is they ask this question, do elections remove ineffective leaders? And you see over a period of time, about 10 years, that the numbers are shifting a little bit from a majority of people who would say yes to now more people saying no than yes. And so that's really where some of my concern comes from, is, are elections going to be a route to change? Elections are only one part of democracy. They are a thing that happens at a distinct period, and there's a whole lot more to democracy than that. But they are a big part of democracy, and right now I'm concerned about the state of those elections. I'll pause there. There's a lot to unpack here, but I hope that's a useful baseline and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, John. Now I'm going to turn things over to Judy Moore, who is also going to make some opening remarks, and then we'll come back with our question and answer period. Also, just a reminder to our audience members, please put your questions in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to your questions later in the program. Judy?
Thank you, Claire. And again, thanks to the Vail Symposium. It's a pleasure being here. Sorry, I'm just gonna do my little clock thing so I can time myself and make sure I don't talk overboard. And thanks, John, for that presentation. I think the way I see the path of democracy in Africa is that progress is meandering, that progress isn't an unbroken linear ascent, especially for complex systems. I had, there was this description of the difference between something that's complicated and something that's complex. A complicated problem can be solved. It's complicated, it's difficult, but it can be solved with a technical solution. For example, sending a rocket into space, that's a complicated problem. A complex problem, of course, cannot be solved simply with a technical solution. For example, raising a child, building an educational system, those are complex. Developing a democracy and building democratic systems, that's a complex problem. And so the development is never going to be linear. John mentioned Afrobarometer, and I think it's 2019, the last survey they did of 35 African countries about the demand for democracy, for accountable government. A majority in almost all of the countries they surveyed of Africans want a government that is accountable, one that is democratic. So the demand for democracy remains in Africa, that by a majority, Africans prefer democratic leadership than they do autocratic ones. And that demand is showing up in weird places, that even autocratic regimes on the continent seek some veneer of legitimacy by running sham elections. And for me, as terrible as those are, the fact that they're trying to run those elections is itself a confirmation that they understand that the population they're dealing with requires, wants, demands accountable government. And so that's a good thing for me. The second is that the supply of democracy is where Afrobarometer saw the problem in terms of the quality of leadership that we're seeing in countries. And that supply is sort of hindered by the erosion of the social contract in a lot of, so as we saw throughout the pandemic, most African society, most African governments did little or nothing in terms of assisting people to face loss of livelihoods, loss of income. Here in the US and across the West, democratic systems responded by providing assistance to people. Even today, those social safety nets have been expanded across the West, where in most places in Africa, people had to face that on their own. And that is leading to the corruption and erosion of the social contract, because it seems that the people are doing their part, but their government isn't doing their part. And so that is affecting that. And because of that, there are governments on the continent who have developed only hard tools, right? Because of the undeveloped institutions, the institution has developed the most are the ones with the use of force. So even in enforcing movement restrictions for public health reasons for COVID, we saw a significant amount of violence against citizens, and some of those incidents led to deaths. So, but I also want to say that, again, I am hopeful generally for the direction of the continent's democracy. A number of events have happened that should give Africans, that give Africans hope that they can continue to see change through the democratic process. One is the Kenyan election a few years ago, where foreign observers, led by John Kerry, said that the process was free and fair, and the Kenyan Supreme Court said it wasn't and canceled that election, and it had to be redone. It was the first time that the High Court had done that on the continent. And then we saw that again in Malawi. And we saw that in Malawi, where the incumbent tried to use the instruments of the state, but the army stood down, and the Supreme Court canceled that election, and the challenger won. And we saw that again in Zambia, where a government had become increasingly autocratic, a president who was trying to technically go for a third term, and the people overwhelmingly voted him out, and there was a transfer. So we're seeing these landmark events in spite of the declines that we've seen in the democratic process, that sort of gives hope to Africans and people on the continent that this process of becoming a more democratic society is not going to be linear. It's not going to be an unbroken ascent. It's going to meander here and there, but the direction is definitely going toward more democratic governance, toward more accountability. And that's what we look to see across the continent. So with that, I'd like to stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Judy. And I would actually welcome Judy, John, and Monde back, both video and audio, and we'll begin our conversation. And I also just wanted to point out to them that I will ask questions, maybe direct it to one, but if anybody else wants to chime in, that's fine. And if it makes somebody think of another question for one of their co-panelists, that would be fine as well. We also have the setting for our webinar right now on active speaker view. So the audience sees whoever is speaking at a given time. So my first question is actually going to go to Monde, and you are with the Wilson Center. I don't think a lot of people understand what the Wilson Center is. So if you would just take a moment to let us know, what is the Wilson Center and what is the Africa program there?
Thank you, Claire, and good evening, everybody. And thank you so much again to the Vail Symposium team for having me back. I loved my last visit a couple of years ago, and it's wonderful to join you for this discussion and join John and Judy as well. So the Wilson Center was created in 1968 by an act of Congress. We are the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. Most presidents get statues. We actually get a building full of scholars who do research on lots of really interesting issues and key issues around the world. So we're a nonpartisan forum. We're a policy forum. Our focus is on bringing scholarship to bear on the world's most pressing challenges by developing policy options that are actionable that we then pass on or feed into the policy ecosystem. So we don't advocate, but we use research and scholarship. Again, as part of the Wilson legacy, the only US president with a PhD, and former president of Princeton University as well, so scholarship is really big. So we try to use scholarship and research to tackle key issues around the world, key issues confronting the United States, and more importantly, to lean into those key issues to develop policy options that policymakers can run with. So we have 14 programs at the Wilson Center. Some are regional, some are thematic, and the Africa program is one of the regional programs there. And our focus really is threefold at the Africa program. We work to address the most critical issues facing Africa and US-Africa relations. We work to build mutually beneficial relations between the United States and Africa. And thirdly, we work to enhance knowledge and understanding about Africa in the United States. I mean, sadly, Africa is not the Middle East. Africa is not Russia, so we don't get as much attention as some of these other regions get. But we believe quite firmly that Africa is important to the United States. So part of our mission is engaging Americans, ordinary Americans, as well as policymakers to explain why Africa matters to the United States. Part of our mission is to look over the horizon at some of these issues that we're discussing here today. The democracy trajectory in Africa. What does that mean for the United States? What options does the United States have to better engage in that space? So these are some of the issues that we address at the Wilson Center in the Africa program specifically.
Thank you for that. And if I could just stay with you for another moment, Monde. Judy alluded to some elections in Zambia. I know that's close to home for you and close to your heart. Would you mind addressing that? I understand they had impressive voter turnout in excess of 70%.
Absolutely, and I think Judy hit the nail on the head. This was it was a very tense election because if you go back and you look at Zambia's trajectory since 1990, when Zambia became a multi-party democracy, one of the first actually on the continent to adopt multi-party politics. I think the country had been making progress on this democratic path. And then all of a sudden, with Lungu coming into office 5 years ago, we see this dramatic downturn of democracy in the country. It was the executive office consolidating power in the hands of the president. It was diminishing the civic space for ordinary Zambians to participate. It was human rights abuses. It was blatant corruption like we had never seen before in the country. There used to be shame in people being corrupt. This was so open and so blatant that we don't even know how much is left of the natural of the country's resources. It was a situation in which COVID was politicized going into the elections, so that the opposition could not campaign on a level playing field. It was a situation in which the voters register, which Zambia had had for many years, was thrown out in the middle of COVID. So in the past, it was that you had a voters register. If you had voted before, you were on the voters register, and all you had to do in the lead up to election is to update the information, to update the register. But the entire register was thrown out in the middle of COVID, and citizens were given 38 days to get on to register or not vote at all. I have family members who stood in line from 4 o'clock in the morning until 8 p.m. at night just to register, vote. This is how the country was just energized. And I think people came together. They tried to influence the elections their way. The internet was shut down. Social media platforms were shut down. Opposition parties were not allowed to campaign. But the country came together and held together. The parallel voting system worked well. We had activists who sued the government to open up the internet and to open up the social media, took it all the way to the High Court and won. So that helped as well. We had lawyers amongst the citizenry who were involved in making sure that the process run the way it was supposed to run. So that helped as well. So really, I think a big gain for democracy in very, very difficult circumstances. That we're going to have a transition next week to a new president being sworn in is just tremendous. And one thing that Judah didn't talk about is that the number of young people who voted. And he can speak to this in terms of other countries, that engagement, young people wanting change, young people wanting accountability. For me, that's a good thing. I see that across the continent, of young people wanting their leaders to work on behalf of the country. Right now, there is a contract that's going out on social media saying, Hakainde Hichilema, here's a contract from the people of Zambia. If you don't perform, if you don't deliver, we will terminate your contract in 5 years. And I think that's a good sign.
That sounds great. So I'd like to start addressing some of the external factors affecting governance in Africa. For instance, these factors could be governments, the United States, China, Russia, or they could be other external influences such as the pandemic and climate change. So let's begin with the US. John, you've written about the limits of state-to-state diplomacy due to rising authoritarianism, and that the Biden administration's foreign policy should prioritize engagement with civil society organizations. Would you elaborate on this suggestion, and what would that look like? And is it too soon to tell if the Biden administration is taking your advice?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. Part of the argument that I've made is that in countries that are less than democratic, and in countries that we are seeing the kind of democratic backsliding that I've talked about, there are questions about who's legitimate and who speaks for the people if a leader really wasn't elected on fair grounds. And that's in particular where I think engagement with civil society and with all of the groups that represent the diversity of a country is even more important. It's important everywhere. But I think that kind of engagement is even more important in some of these authoritarian systems, and where I would really like to see the United States emphasizing it so that we are making connections with all those different groups. And so that we are showing, in effect, that we don't believe that a leader who is not legitimate necessarily gets to speak for all of his people and all of his country. Interesting note on this, President Biden recently announced plans for a summit of democracy, which he has been talking about for a while. And now that's going to happen, the first phase of it, virtually this coming December. One of the things that we advocate at Freedom House and many others do is how important it is that civil society organizations have a really robust role in that summit for democracy. And that as we are having these big picture conversations about the future of democracy, it's not just heads of state who are sitting around the table, but it's representatives of all these different groups, all these different interests who have a real voice in the proceedings. So to your question about, is the administration doing enough on this front? I'm really going to be watching for one indicator as to who's going to be part of that conversation as they pull together the Summit for Democracy.
Monday, this question is somewhat related to that one. You spoke for the Vail Symposium 2 years ago, and at the time you expressed positive views of the Bush administration's engagement in Africa, I think to many people in the audience's surprise, but felt that the Obama administration was slow to engage. We're 7 months into the Biden administration. How do you think they're doing?
That's a good question. Look, I think the environment in Washington has a lot to do with how soon different administrations engage on Africa. Again, when you look at the broader picture, there's so many pressing issues. Right now, we have Afghanistan going on. We have COVID going on. And in many people's minds, as I said earlier, when it comes to US interests in Africa, they're not up here, right? So there's a part of me that understands why, in the midst of everything else that the country is confronted with, that maybe we don't, Africa is not a priority. So we understand that as people who work in the Africa space. Having said that, I think that the Biden administration has started out making sending all the right signals. First of all, I think they recognize that the legacy that they have inherited from the Trump administration on Africa was one that had challenges in terms of the tone that had been set on speaking about Africa, in terms of the engagement with Africa at different levels. I don't think President Trump ever visited Africa at all. So, the senior leadership that visited Africa during his term. So I think there is a lot there in terms of that inheritance, the language that was used to talk about Africa. The fact that it took so long for some of the key appointments and some of the Africa positions at that very senior level to be announced. All of those are issues that left many Africans, I think, wondering where Africa fit into the larger US international affairs. So President Biden has gone out. He spoke at the AU summit. He has gone out. He has talked about restoring multilateralism. And I think in the previous administration, there was a sense that multilateralism was under attack with the America First approach to things. And so that restoration of multilateralism is something that I think a lot of Africans are looking forward to, given how much stock we put in, or Africans put into the UN and other international organizations that impact Africa so much. So that's one piece. I think a second piece for it is the climate, the Paris Climate Accords. That's a big one. Africans have talked quite openly about the fact that they're not the biggest contributors to the climate issues that we have, and yet they bear a heavy burden. And dropping out of the Paris Peace Accord was something that bothered Africans, a lot of Africans a lot. And so I think with the Biden administration signing back onto that, to the accords is a big thing for Africa. I think another issue is the issue that John, you all have talked about, actually, COVID. I think there's now more of a global outlook in terms of how we approach COVID than there was before. So that's another thing that Africans are valuing and looking to see how that's going to play out. The issue of democracy, that's a big one. I've talked about this before. Sometimes I get into trouble for saying it, but I think, the events of January 6th showed that democracy is also a work in progress, even here in the United States, that it is something that you have to fight to safeguard. Some people see that as diminishing the US voice on democracy around the world. I don't think so. I think it actually gives some really good entry points to say, as long as we have been a democracy, we are still engaged in making sure we safeguard our democracy. It is not an endpoint. Democracy isn't. It is actually a journey. It is a process. You have to keep engaged. You have to keep working hard at it. So I think it gives the US some entry points to engage on this democracy question with African countries in a different way than we have been able to in the past.
Thank you. Judy, you were talking about how many of the authoritarian governments do try to have kind of a thin veneer of democracy. They hold elections, even though they may not be entirely free and fair. And I'm just wondering if perhaps the authoritarian leadership in Africa was less welcoming and excited about a Biden administration for fear of enhanced scrutiny.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, but see, I think Africa as a space in which foreign policy is practiced by external actors has changed, right? And the change that I'm talking about is that the US is no longer the only active actor in that space. There are other actors in that space for whom this question of democracy may not be the first thing to think about in their engagement with African governments. And I'm thinking about China here on this question, or say Turkey, that has gone from 12 to over 42 embassies across the continent, where Turkey is now beginning to challenge France as it sees France as its competitor on the continent. And so there's that. And the Chinese model, I should say that it finds resonance in some of these places, even in places that are not autocratic, because what the Chinese model doesn't center human rights, it centers economic rights. Right, that in exchange, that some of the freedoms that are common in liberal democracies may not be available, but we're going to provide economic opportunities for you. And then we saw in 2008 the collapse that happened. We saw the initial response to COVID and how the Chinese were able to keep it under control. It sort of gave some sort of boost to the narrative that China was giving, that in terms of governance, in terms of model, maybe they have something here that's active. And so for people who live in places where the economic conditions have been really, really difficult, there's some sort of resonance to that. However, what we've seen, though, is different, right, in terms of what the people are actually demanding. So one of the things we've seen is in a place like South Africa, where we saw the looting and all the violence that happened. I mean, that's the negative side that people saw. But before that, South Africa is the most unequal society in the world, not just in Africa, in terms of how little people actually share in their economy. And so because of what happened, South Africa now might have probably the world's most generous social benefit system, maybe a universal basic income because of that. Democracy, like I've noted, is not a linear ascent. That democracy meanders, it goes back and forth. And I think now that the US is going to be facing Africa and the Biden administration is going to be facing Africa, it is important to understand that, one, Africans themselves are driving this narrative in terms of the demand for democracy. Two, that Africa is not a clear space anymore. There are other actors in there who have a narrative that's different from what the US is bringing. And so thirdly, that the US will have some humility in its engagement with its African partners because of January 6th, because of what's happening in terms of its own democracy. Those three things I think are going to be very, very important as the Biden administration faces the continent.
Thank you. And so I think now is a great time to pivot to China. According to Forbes, and I think these are 2019 numbers, China is Africa's biggest trading partner. Sino-African trade topping $200 billion a year. And according to McKinsey, there are over 10,000 Chinese-owned firms currently operating throughout Africa. So John, I'd like to start with you and discuss infrastructure. Historically, colonizers were accused of building infrastructure that facilitated the extraction of natural resources from Africa. The Chinese are major players in infrastructure in Africa. Are they using infrastructure for extraction? Are African countries hoping that infrastructure will propel them to develop as it did for China? What about Chinese manufacturing in Africa? And what about China's lending to Africa, especially since the pandemic? Has that started to taper off? And are the concerns that this is kind of a debt trap? I know I've just thrown a lot at you, but is that a fair accusation?
Well, let me respond really briefly, because honestly, a lot of what I've learned on this issue, I've learned from reading what Judy writes. And I'd really like to kick a lot of that question over to him, given his expertise and where he focuses. Let me just say something briefly, which is that I thought the way that the previous US administration set up this US versus China dynamic in Africa was really unfortunate. And they didn't create that dynamic. That kind of narrative has been around for a long time, but they really supercharged it. And the greatest fault of that is that it removed a whole lot of agency from Africans, and it made, this kind of false picture of great power competition happening on the continents, as if there weren't many people there, which is a really unfortunate way to look at anything. The one other thing I'll say is that China shows up in a lot of places the US does not, and China offers things that the US doesn't. And, given the choice, a lot of Africans may choose, the US made road over the Chinese made road, or the US loan over the Chinese loan if it's better deal. But that choice often isn't there. And so I think a lot of Africans are in a position where they do need to take some of these options that are in front of them to deal with some real pressing issues that citizens deal with on a daily basis. But beyond that, I would defer to some of the greater expertise we have in the room here.
Judy, did you want to add anything to John's comments?
Yeah, just quickly to that. I think John spoke about it here, where the annual gap deficit in infrastructure financing on the continent, in spite of everything China has done, in spite of everything the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank have done, is somewhere between $68 billion to $108 billion a year. So it tells us that Chinese lending is not displacing any lender. That even after everything the Chinese have done, there's still a massive infrastructure gap on the continent. This space, if China were to stop lending tomorrow, there is no like-for-like replacement globally that is going to take China's place, that has the appetite for the risk associated with African infrastructure to be able to do that. So I think hopefully that the US, the narrative, the framing of countering China, of a great power competition, that doesn't dominate this conversation, because they're complementary things. If China is providing hard infrastructure like ports, roads, rail, the US can provide human capital infrastructure, soft infrastructure like education, health systems. And those two are complementary. And my hope is that African governments can push both partners to begin to actually collaborate for global public goods, especially human development.
Thanks, Judy. And I'd actually like to stay with you, because several questions have come in around disinformation. And we've talked about China, the US, and Turkey, but I'm also curious about Russia. Russia's playbook in Europe as well as in the United States has been to use disinformation to influence elections, to divide society. Are they active in Africa? Are they using the same playbook, or are they doing other things in Africa?
I think there was a troll farm in West Africa, a Russian troll farm there that was trying to do some of the same things. The extent isn't the same as it is elsewhere. Russia has a playbook. The playbook is African countries, or it doesn't have to be an African country. These are countries that the West is no longer actually dealing with. So we're talking like the Central African republics, places that have some sort of security problem, and Russia can come and provide us a solution there. But Russia is also beyond that playbook. Russia is also signing a lot of MOUs on nuclear deals, sort of negotiating, developing nuclear power for civilian use. That's the kind of stuff that we're seeing the Russians do. So it's providing sort of mercenaries through the Wagner Group in countries that are having security problems, and doing a little bit of what they do best in terms of the trolling. But it doesn't have the same kind of impact in Africa as it's having elsewhere. Maybe Monday.
So I want to return to the topic of South Africa. I think of all the countries in Africa, South Africa probably gets more press at least in the United States than most other countries. And the press of the last few weeks has been disturbing. The Economist says the country is on the brink. The New York Times writes, South Africa is falling apart. John, on your map, South Africa was green. Is South Africa still a green country, a free country, or is South Africa in trouble?
It's both. It's still a free country, and I don't expect that to change, and it's in some trouble right now. But just in terms of freedoms, people are very free to speak what they say, speak what they believe. They are free to protest, although there has been some heavy-handed response to that protest. The media is very much free. The courts operate very effectively. And let's take note of what's happening right now. President Zuma is in prison. And many people would have said this never could have happened. And he is facing a whole lot of charges around, among other things, the state capture phenomenon that happened under his watch and the incredible level of corruption that happened under his watch. Now, his arrest is just a start in terms of addressing that. But this is a country where the courts have the capacity to hold very powerful figures to account, and the media has the capacity to report on it without any threat to their well-being. And civil society is quite active in advocating around those sorts of issues. And, when you talk to South Africans about how did the country make it through that really difficult period of state capture when Zuma was in charge, they do cite those three things: media, the courts, and civil society. So South Africa is definitely dealing with some very difficult headwinds right now. The COVID pandemic there and the fourth wave they're going through is quite difficult. I have colleagues in South Africa who I'm constantly in touch with, and it's really a tough situation given the combination of COVID and now some of the political instability. But in my mind, South Africa remains a free country and has a lot of those sort of built-in tools to deal with some of the really significant challenges that they're facing.
Great. Mondi, I'd like to direct this audience question from Karen to you. She asks, have any of you analyzed whether the remnants of governmental attitudes of the various prior European colonizers have had an effect on how African nations are dealing with democracy today?
Do you mind if I pass that one on to the former minister over there? Judy, I think you were up close and personal with this issue, right in it.
Yeah, I think in terms of, I don't know the answer to that question. I would just offer an opinion. I think definitely political culture doesn't sort of evaporate overnight. That in a lot of instances, the governments that took over from the colonial authorities did not have the reach. And so for them to be able to pacify the population, they, just like the colonial authorities, they increasingly had to turn to more violent means of being able to do that. And I think in a lot of the state security services, some of that attitude, that culture still remains. But again, I would just like to temper that with saying that, 89 years after independence in the United States, 89 years after independence, this country was torn apart in a civil war. Most African countries are just counting like 60 years since independence, and they've come really, really, really far. So if we take a longer view at the democratic process and the evolution of democracy and the evolution of institutions, I think, it's not as terrible as it looks. On Friday, we're expecting judgment from the courts in Kenya, where the government is trying to change the constitution, trying to basically change how Kenya is governed, and they were taken to court. And there's a possibility here that the government might lose. So yeah, we still have vestiges of the colonial past, but we're also building new institutions and new political culture on the continent.
Yeah,
Judy, I'm sorry, go ahead.
sorry, I just wanted to agree with what Judy said. The only thing I would add is that I think most Africans just reinforce the point that you made, that the nature of the leadership changed, the nature of the state itself did not change at independence. And those countries that are doing well are those who have been able to bring some level of transformation to what their state is. And so for my money, the states that are still in that old colonial mode, I think they're not doing too well. They're the ones with really bad social contracts. They're the ones who've not really fundamentally asked themselves a question of what was independence all about and what does it mean to the ordinary man on the street. And so I absolutely agree with you that there are institutions being built. Some countries are transforming faster than others in terms of those governance institutions, but others are still stuck in that colonial model.
So we've been mentioning the pandemic in passing. And Judy, I'd like to just go back to you because you recently hosted a podcast addressing vaccine development in Africa. So my question to you would be really about the need for African-based vaccine manufacturing. What will it take to make it happen? And why is it imperative that Africa do so? Sorry, you're still muted.
That's the anthem of the pandemic. You're muted. Today, there was a story where White House and high-ranking US government officials were playing down WHO condemnation of the booster shots, saying it made no sense to go to booster shots when so many, that 10 countries have administered 75% of all vaccines administered in the world. That is incredible. And so for places in Africa, the two places without vaccine manufacturing capacity or low vaccine manufacturing capacity are Latin America and Africa. So on this podcast, the question I asked, because scientific modeling shows that there is a 45 to 57% chance that in the next 25 years, there will be a pandemic the size and scale of this. So if African countries had 25 years to prepare, how do they ensure that there's vaccine manufacturing capacity there? And it's the one thing that I would say is that if anyone started to manufacture vaccines tomorrow on the continent, you're going to face the problem of, is it sustainable? Can you meet India's price? Mm-hmm. And so because governments are the large clients and multilateral funds like Gavi, my guest suggested something he called a resilience premium. So that we agree that when they first start manufacturing over a period, their prices are going to be slightly more expensive than, say, India. We're willing to be able to pay that slightly higher price so that we can be able to develop that. But if Africa doesn't develop, I'll just say this quickly. Ebola killed between 88 and 90% of the people who got it. So the case, the fatality for Ebola was really high. For COVID, it's very infectious, but not as fatal. There is a possibility that we'll come across a virus that is both fatal and infectious. And if we don't have the capacity, it will be worse than it is today. And so for most African governments now, my hope is that they're actually thinking about building local manufacturing for at least a medical supply chain.
So my next question involves the impact of climate change. And the BBC aired a program yesterday on seaweed cultivation in Zanzibar, where farmers now have to move farther out to sea because the warming waters, apparently seaweed is vulnerable to warm waters, so they have to farm farther out. This summer saw very severe flooding in Lagos, Africa's most populous city. And Africa, of course, is the most fastest urbanizing population in the world. How are African nations being affected by climate change in different ways, and how are they responding to it? John, would you like to start?
Can I maybe hand this one over to Monday? I think she might be maybe a little bit better situated on this one.
I haven't really looked at the responses on the African continent when it comes to climate change. I do know that there are a number of initiatives that are underway. Green initiatives and green strategies that are being developed at the regional level, that have been developed at the national level. Some countries are developing their climate change strategies. I don't know if every single African country has one, but I do know that a number of countries do. I think the key for me is going to be in the implementation, as always. And my argument is really that we should not be looking at climate change from a national, through a national lens, because really this is something in which all of us have a stake. And so finding that global framework, committing to that global framework, helping the countries that are most vulnerable and preparing for the future are some of the things that I would like to see in as we move forward on these issues. There's no doubt about the impacts of climate change in Africa. They're everywhere. It's everywhere. You see it everywhere. And so the question is, can we develop that global framework that people commit to, that has leadership at the international level for us to be able to follow through? Because this is not a national problem. It's a global problem.
We are just
Let me just add one point to that, if I may. The line that is used a lot, which is entirely true, is that Africa is least responsible for contributing to climate change and is feeling most of the effects in many ways. What's so important here is that Africa has a seat at the table in the global conversation about how we respond to climate change.
Exactly.
A lot of other global issues too, cyber issues, COVID, and so forth. And Africa has really been denied a seat at that table and a voice in those global conversations, which are really still dominated by the North and dominated by a handful of countries. And so, that's what I would push for more than anything is, particularly since the continent is so affected by this dynamic, they need to be very central in conversations about the solution.
So we are really just about out of time, and I would like to offer our panelists the last word. And the focus on tonight's program was on democracy in Africa. So Judy, why don't we start with you? I'll give you the final word about your thoughts on democracy in Africa going forward.
It looks like most of the young people on the continent and are driving that push toward democracy. We saw Bobby Wine in Uganda, even though the government claimed he got 35% of the vote. But if everything the government did to him, he still got 35% of the vote. And he was basically driven by the young people. And I think it is a really, really hopeful time because Africa's future is actually in their hands and they're looking toward a more democratic society. So I'm excited about that.
That's a very optimistic take. Monday, do you share that optimistic take?
I do, in fact. I think sometimes we get too bogged down on the negative narrative about Africa, and it closes us off, it closes our eyes off to some of the transformation that's occurring on the continent. Whether you're looking at, the tech space, whether you're looking at this generation of leaders that's trying to emerge on the African continent, whether you're looking at some of the innovation that came out of Africa around COVID, young people and their, some of their inventions to help their communities better deal with COVID. But when we're looking at the way Africans themselves are fighting to defend democracy, to entrench democracy, all of those are positives. And I would just say, let's focus, even as we deal with the challenges, let's also focus on some of the positive transformation that's occurring on the continent. On the trade side, just to close off on that, I would say, for instance, I thought President Obama did a fantastic job in terms of laying the economic infrastructure for engaging Africa. President Trump built on that with Prosper Africa and the BUILD Act. I think there are opportunities to expand and deepen that engagement, even as we deal with democracy issues. So look at both the positives, not just the challenges.
Thank you. And John, we'll give you the final word tonight.
Thanks, and thanks again for having me. Certainly agree with the points made by my colleagues, and I know that the picture that I painted at the beginning was a grim one, and you know, I think as a snapshot, it's true. But I would also point out that a lot of the churn and instability that we're seeing right now is a product of the demand for greater democracy. And Judy is absolutely right in pointing out the real big gap between the demand and supply of democracy on the continent right now. And so people in some instances are taking matters into their own hands. They're out on the streets. They are trying to push out some leaders who have been there way too long. And that creates a lot of this volatility in what looks like backsliding. And in some cases, it's real backsliding, but in some cases, it's a product of the demand that is there and not going anywhere. And so despite some of the skepticism, I share my colleagues' optimism about the overall trajectory because I think Africans' commitment to democracy is very firm.
Thank you so much. This has been a lovely conversation, and I love it when we end on an optimistic note. Monde, Judy, John, thank you so much. Thanks to everybody watching at home, and I hope we'll see you next week for our program with Judy Woodruff and Al Hunt. Good night, and thank you, everyone.